Dean at the Rutgers Law School Newark campus, and I welcome you to today's event, Locked Up in a Lockdown, New Challenges for Those Incarcerated and Detained During the Pandemic. I want to thank, first of all, the Rutgers Center on Criminal Justice, Youth Rights and Race, the Rutgers Immigration Rights Clinic, and the Rutgers Criminal and Youth Justice Clinic for putting this event together and hosting it. I want to thank Senator Powell for all of her tremendous advocacy. I'm glad that you were able to join us, Senator. Thank you so much. To kick things off, I wanted to kind of go back to a Philosophy 101 class, and I think many of you went through this, where they give you a hypothetical on lifeboat ethics in terms of who you want to throw over, who you would throw over if the lifeboat was going down. This is no longer hypothetical. I think with the great pandemic, we're living this, unfortunately, in real time. And so what we're facing right now is not only, I believe, an unraveling of our social contract, but a crisis in humanity as we look at how society has marginalized, silenced, and dismissed certain vulnerable populations. You see it with the pandemic itself, as people even dispute the death count, as the elderly and the disabled are viewed as expendable. But you certainly see it with respect to the consequences of the pandemic, the economic fallout, and the public health fallout. You see it in terms of the homeless community, which is growing as we face eviction tsunamis around the country. You see it with the immigrant community that is living further in poverty and in the margins than they ever have. You see it, certainly with essential workers, such as those farm workers in the meatpacking industry. And you see all of this widening inequality in the context of heightened prosperity for certain sectors of society. You see the stock market going up, you see people getting richer. I know many of us on this call are certainly blessed in terms of, being in the information society and able to have these Zoom conferences. But this is a real crisis for the country. It's a real crisis for humanity. And I think you also see the effort to silence and extinguish vulnerable populations with the incarcerated. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I think there's certainly a recognition in some quarters that, like the homeless community, like the immigrant community, that those that are incarcerated don't have a political voice, they don't have economic clout. Citizens United doesn't mean anything to them, they don't gain any benefit of this. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how to push back and all the steps that we have to deal with, what is happening in our country in real time in terms of vulnerable populations. So I really want to thank Laura, Professor Cohen, for the tremendous work you've done in this space, and really for your constant advocacy and efforts on behalf of vulnerable populations.
Thank you, Dean Lopez. And welcome, everyone. I am just trying to make sure that everything is working here properly. So all of you folks who are on the call, can you just let me know, are you seeing me or are you seeing Dean Lopez?
You.
Me, okay, good. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here today, joining us for this important conversation. And thank you to Dean Lopez for his support of our clinical programs, of our centers, and of the work that we are doing on behalf of incarcerated people with all of the wonderful people you're going to hear from today. As I'm speaking, I'm going to show you some artwork made by people who are incarcerated all over the country during the pandemic. And what this artwork does is to capture the sense of isolation the sense of fear, the sense of anger, and the sense of helplessness that is shared by so many people behind bars. The wrath of the coronavirus has been most acutely felt in carceral settings where social distancing is impossible and sanitation often subpar. Prisons, jails, immigrant detention centers, and youth facilities. As of September 8th, approximately 121,000 people, I just want to repeat that, 121,000 people around the country have tested positive for the virus in US prisons, jails, and detention centers. This is a 5% increase from the week before. At least 1,017 people have died, a number that in all likelihood is underreported. Incarcerated people are infected by the coronavirus at a rate that is more than 5 times the nation's overall rate. And the death rate among incarcerated people is also higher than the national rate. Tragically, New Jersey has one of the highest rates of carceral infection and death in the country. To date, 3,009 incarcerated and detained people have tested positive in our state, the 4th highest per capita infection rate in the country. And more tragically, 49 people have died, the highest death rate in the nation. The rapid spread of COVID-19 behind bars has contributed to disparately high rates of infection among communities of color, particularly the Black community. Although those disparities are rooted in many causes, one is the most pervasive and continuing mass incarceration of Black people and its attendant impact on short and long-term health outcomes for those currently and formerly incarcerated. And even for those who have not been infected, the virus has further denigrated every aspect of life on the inside, which, as we all know, is already unrelentingly harmful. Jails, prisons, and detention centers around the country have essentially been on lockdown mode since March. Family visits have been suspended, programming placed on hold, social work interactions cut short or done remotely, educational programs suspended, institutional work assignments slashed, and recreation curtailed. Worse still, incarcerated and detained people live in constant fear of contracting the virus and know that if they do, they almost certainly will receive inadequate medical treatment and little, if any, care or attention. As frightening as all of this is for adults, it is even worse for the 48,000 confined children and adolescents across the United States and the more than 200 children and adolescents who are incarcerated in New Jersey. So today, we have a large task in front of us. We are going to take stock of where we are in New Jersey and nationally. We are going to hear from advocates, from attorneys, from experts, and most importantly, from people who have been directly impacted by the virus behind bars, those who have been incarcerated or detained, and their family members. We will attempt to grapple with solutions to the problem. We will take stock of everything that has happened in New Jersey to try to liberate the incarcerated, to bring them home, and to make things safer for those who remain inside. And we will try to take stock of what is next, what work is left to be done. I'll introduce our speakers as we come to their turn. And what I would encourage you to do, because there's a lot of you and a lot of us here, is to ask questions in the chat. And I will try to keep track of those questions as folks are speaking. And we'll pose them as we go along. So I would first like to introduce J. Amos Cali, who is the Associate Pastor of Worship and Faith Engagement at the Reformed Church of Highland Park. And he is also the lead organizer of the New Jersey campaign for alternatives to isolated confinement, which, as I understand it, has just changed its name. And so I think we'll be hearing from Amos about the new name of the organization. He will be joined by Ms. Trina Parks and Mr. Scott Clements. Both Ms. Parks and Mr. Clements are have siblings who either are or were incarcerated in the New Jersey state prison system. You're going to hear their tragic stories, and you're going to hear about the amazing advocacy they have been doing on behalf of their loved ones and everyone who is behind bars in our state. So Amos, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you for all thanks to all who have organized this. This is a timely and important event. So I'm Amos Cali. As you heard, I'm the associate pastor of the Reformed Church of Highland Park, lead organizer for the New Jersey Prison Justice Watch, newly formed. I've had the sad but sacred privilege of working closely with people and with families who have been the most directly impacted by this deadly pandemic, especially resulting from the choices and policies of the Department of Corrections and the administration. COVID-19 took everyone by surprise, as we all know, and we had to make some major adjustments, all of us, personally and professionally. But those of us who had been reading and studying anything about this deadly virus, we knew that it would impact people in prisons and other confined spaces the most heavily. And as we all know, incarcerated people cannot adequately maintain social distance, at least not in the humane ways that are necessary. And so much of our personal protective practices that we implement in the public were and are not readily available to those in our prisons. For those reasons and many others, pretty quickly, as you just heard, because of the insufficient action and inaction, New Jersey rose to the unenviable position of first in the nation among all states for its death rate by COVID in prisons. It's remained in that first place position for 5 months, and it remains true today. We needed dramatic action at the beginning of this on behalf of vulnerable populations in prison. And we need dramatic action today on behalf of not just the vulnerable populations in prison, but on behalf of those who work in prisons and on behalf of the families who are expecting to receive their loved ones. So we knew if we had any chance of calling upon our state leaders to take quick, smart, and compassionate action, we needed to listen carefully to the experiences and grievances and concerns of prisoners and their family members. So among the many very strong and gripping voices who have led us in this urgent work, I'm happy to say that 2 of those family members have agreed to join us today. These people are among the most courageous people I've ever met. They're courageous leaders who have helped propel all of the public education and legislative work through the summer. And it's my great honor to introduce them to you one at a time. So first up, we're joined by Ms. Trina Parks. She's gonna share a little bit of what happened to her and to her brother, as well as recapping some of the things that took place this summer to demand action. So Ms. Parks, would you take it away?
Yes. Again, thank you for having me. It's hard for me because I still can't wrap my head around not being able to talk to my brother. My brother was at Trenton State Prison. He had been there for 29 years. He was 62 years old. He had diabetes, high blood pressure, tuberculosis, and hepatitis C. So he was vulnerable to the COVID virus. He was seen by a medical professional on a number of issues because he had so many. So therefore they knew that he was vulnerable but nothing was done. They kept him in general population. They never even called to say that he was sick. One of the inmates called my sister, and that's how we found out that he had been taken to the hospital. We called the hospital, and we were going back and forth with the jail and the hospital. When we finally got through to the hospital, a week and a half later, he passed away. And it's just, I just can't understand why, when we had been warned by the CDC and everybody watched the news, everybody knew what was going on. They said that the prisons would be the ones that would be hit hard because of the close proximity of the individuals there. And if they were to be in protective custody of the state of New Jersey, they were not protected. They did nothing. They just sat there and let those inmates stay in there together until my brother couldn't breathe and the inmate summoned a guard to have him taken out. And a week and a half later, he would be dead. And that's the hardest part that I have of understanding how this could have happened. When speaking with other people, I have a friend in Seattle, Washington, who had a friend that was in the county jail, and he was immediately taken out because of his age and his vulnerability and placed somewhere else. And the same thing could have been done for my brother. The death that he died was not supposed to happen. He was not given a life sentence, but the state of New Jersey sentenced him to death. That was a preventable death, and I'm just having a hard time grappling with that.
Thank you so much. Ms. Parks, I've heard you speak about your brother so many times, and it doesn't get any easier at all to hear, and it doesn't feel like there's any closure at all with this. So I just want to ask maybe one more follow-up. What kinds of things were you able to do this summer to draw attention to what happened to you and to demand sufficient response? I would just love to hear your appraisal of what kind of transpired this summer.
Well, through Salvation and Social Justice, Pastor Boyer, Amos, your organization, CAKE, the ACLU, we have done a candlelight vigil, a town hall meeting, a funeral procession, which drew a lot of attention with the media outlets as well, and just constantly speaking out every chance that we get. Myself, every couple of days, like after today, I'm emailing Governor Murphy. It's every time I just go through what I'm going through and feeling what I'm feeling, I just have to just put it in writing and send it to him. And I'm every chance that I get on Facebook, every time he posts something, my response is, as it relates to the individuals that you never gave condolences to our families at all. Like, you just disregarded the whole thing. My Senator Vin Gopal, he even called me and said, Trina, I noticed that you always make remarks about Governor Murphy. Is there something you want to tell him? And I said, yes, because he doesn't answer my emails. He said, well, send me the letter and I will take it to him personally. And knowing Vin has taken him my letters, and they say the same thing over and over again, how he never gave the families of those individuals that died in his custody of COVID a condolence. And I'm constantly asking him to give these individuals a posthumous pardon, because I believe that that is the least that he can do. I mean, they're gone. That's it. It wasn't by no fault of their own. The best thing that you can do for us is to just pardon those people, because they died a senseless death.
Thank you, sincerely, Ms. Parks. And we remain committed, not just myself, but those on this call. I can confidently tell you that we remain committed to listening to you and to elevating your voice as much as possible. you've led us this far, and I'm sure you're going to continue to lead us.
I will.
Thank you again.
Thank you. So I have to check out. My husband is waiting for me for dinner. So thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you. And then I'd like to also introduce you all to somebody who's become a good friend of mine, and I kind of wish it didn't take tragedy or the prospect of tragedy to communicate with such a strong individual. So I'm very privileged to be able to introduce you to Mr. Scott Clements, who's going to share a little bit about what he's been going through, and particularly his family as they correspond with his brother, Brian. Scott.
Thank you, Amos. And can everyone hear me? Yes, okay. Amos, thank you. And I thank all of you today for taking some time to listen to my family story. I will apologize in advance. We do wear emotions on our sleeve. So some of this I'll get through very strong, some of this I won't. The story of my family starts with my brother, Brian, who, rightly so, both Brian and our family have admitted, 8.5 years ago, my brother made a tremendous mistake. But in turn, he was given a sentence to do a certain amount of time. And he's done that in an incredibly respectful and appropriate fashion. The strides he's made as a person are incredible. When I say that, it's more personally. My brother professionally was a business owner. He employed incredible amounts of people from our communities. He was extremely philanthropic. He volunteered his time for youth sports and education. So again, he did a lot in his life, but he made a tremendous mistake. And he had to, unfortunately, do that time and be incarcerated for that mistake. Once the COVID, though, broke out earlier this year, my brother had approximately, at maximum, just about a year left on his incarceration. And one of the things that I've said through the entire time that my brother's been incarcerated, and something he said, is that there wasn't much he feared in life. There was a lot of unknowns about being incarcerated, but there wasn't much that he feared. And he said, through his now 7.5 years of being incarcerated, he said, no, there's been many dangerous situations and challenges that he's faced, but he's been able to see those challenges. He's been able to face them. He's been able to deal with them. What COVID-19 and this virus has done is it's invisible. He can't see it coming. He doesn't know when it can come near him. He doesn't know when it's going to hurt those around him or God forbid him. That's his biggest fear. He said, Scott, I've never been so afraid in my life than I am these days now. He does, he went into prison as a diabetic, but since he's been there, he's developed heart disease, prostate issues, numerous other things that put him massively at high risk if he's to get this virus. And one of the things that when my brother was incarcerated that he did from day one was he had respect for those that were incarcerated with him, but also the folks that work for DOC. And, it's been torturous because there's almost been a bond formed between those people that are working daily inside the facilities, along with those that are incarcerated. Because as my brother said himself, he said, Scott, all of us, those that are incarcerated and those that are working here, he said, we talk every day about whether or not who's going to die or if we're going to make it. This has been every single minute of every single day since this virus hit. Now I have an 84-year-old mother who used to go see my brother. Now with the virus has not been able to see her son. And through this process, it's been, thankfully, we're able to talk to him on a daily basis, but it's been very difficult because every day she just hopes my son's done everything he can for almost the majority of his sentence, and now a virus is going to take him out. For myself, I have one child. I have an only child, a young son, about 16 years old. My brother Brian is his godfather. And he wrote my brother a birthday card in August, and all he said was, I can't wait for you to get home so that we can work together. My son, like my brother, started his own business. And all he wants to do is work with his godfather. And what is so shocking about all this is that what it's doing to families every minute of every day, there's such a concern. Now, thankfully, I've been introduced to both Amos and thankfully Alex Shalom and the incredible people from NJCAIC and the Salvation and Social Justice and the ACLU I was introduced to them by the grace of God and have been able to, and told them, you have my full commitment to however I can help, whatever I can do. Because it's not only about bringing my brother Brian home. Through my brother Brian, I've been able to meet so many other those individuals that are incarcerated and those that maybe don't have the family support and infrastructure my brother has. And by me just providing updates to my brother, who then provides them to these other, those that are incarcerated, it's almost like it's the last gasp of hope and breath that they have every day. It blows me away that those people that have simply only have, 12 months or less, and initially only 8 months or less. If it would be one thing if my brother had 12 years left or 20 years left, he's months within coming home. And for him to not be able to just be able to come out and to save his life and other of those that are incarcerated and the folks that work for the DOC and their family members. I'll leave you with these two stories very quick. I've been very fortunate to meet a woman by the name of Mrs. Ferguson through my time working with Amos and his organizations. Her son was within a matter of weeks from coming home from a halfway house and did not make it home due to COVID virus because they wouldn't release him in time. And like she said, instead of planning a party for her son, she planned a funeral. My two biggest goals in life is, number one, to make sure my mother doesn't have to plan a funeral for my brother because of the fact that he has a matter of months left and people are concerned about other items than him living and another mother having to bury her child. And the next story was my brother Brian just talking to me 2 days ago. There was another gentleman like him who was eligible under this bill if we get it passed. He had already made the arrangements for his daughter to come pick him up. Well, this past week, that gentleman's daughter passed away. He will never see his daughter again, ever. And we're going back and forth. And I understand there's issues and there's things involved and there's certain things that have to be taken care of. I've volunteered to work on reentry committees and how can we make sure all these people, whether they have homes or going to shelters or have cell phones and clothes and toiletries, the effort that's being done by all of us as volunteers, as family members, nobody can even, I think, wrap their head around this. And that we're willing to put people into graves rather than get them out and make their life work blows me away. So I appreciate your time today. I appreciate everybody that's supporting this. And please know that it's not going to stop with my brother Brian. My brother and I have made a lifelong commitment. I've given this to Amos. The day my brother Guy William walks in my mother's house is not when my effort here ends. Nobody deserves this. Nobody. So I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. I mean, that's all I can say. I'm sure that's all anyone can say. Thank you so much for your honesty, your vulnerability, and your courage, just sort of lending all of that to this space. I know that we're all going to hear some amazing features of the work moving forward. I know we're joined by Senator Poe, among all of the people that I am grateful for during this time. I would be remiss if I didn't take an opportunity just to say, even though the action that was taken in the beginning of this effort was insufficient, it created the opportunity for others to really step forward and be the courageous leaders that we hope they can be. And I know that Senator Poe and Assemblyman Mukherjee are really sort of the big leaders that we needed and that we need to thank. We're going to hear a little bit more about that later, but I just want to urge everyone, because this fight is not over. We do not have the prisoners who ought to be home, and really I prefer to call them neighbors because they're our neighbors. So I want to kick it back to Laura, and I'm really excited to hear what all of the rest of the panelists.
Amos, can I just say a final thank you to someone?
Yeah.
I know Senator Poe is on this because you just mentioned it. Senator Poe, my mother herself wanted me to personally thank you for your strength and conviction. And thank you for what you're doing, and Assemblyman Mukherjee, because without you, this never gets to where we are today. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clements, Pastor Cali, Ms. Parks. This has been so powerful and so important. And for the law students who are with us today, what I want you to take away from this is how important it is, how critically crucial it is for any advocacy that we do to start with the people who are actually experiencing the harm that we are trying to abate. It is their stories that have to drive us, that have to inform us, and that have to inspire us. So thank you to all of you for sharing those stories with us. So we have another group of people who have been deeply affected and impacted by the virus in our state, and those are the youth who are incarcerated in our juvenile prisons. And with us today are Ilana Wilf and Alexis Royal. Alexis is a youth advocate who is going to share her story with us. Ilana Wilf is a clinical fellow at Rutgers Law School, where she represents young people incarcerated in our Juvenile Justice Commission facilities as part of the Criminal and Youth Justice Clinic. She's a former juvenile public defender in our state, a former Supreme Court clerk, my dear friend and colleague, and I'm going to turn it over to Ilana now.
Thank you, Laura. I just want to say thank you again to Ms. Parks and Mr. Clemens for those powerful, really heartbreaking stories. Thank you for sharing them. It's a privilege to be here speaking to all of you. As Laura said, I'm a clinical fellow in the Criminal and Youth Justice Clinic, and we represent the young people who are in the custody of the Juvenile Justice Commission in the state. As of last week, I believe there were about 223 young people committed to the Juvenile Justice Commission. Prior to the onset of the pandemic, there were about 270. So that number has come down because of the efforts of the clinic, of the Office of the Public Defender, of Senator Poe, and some of the provisions of S-48 that came into effect early, which you'll hear about. And really, it's been since the onset of the pandemic, we've been representing young people who are scared, who are fearful for their health and safety, and also who are sitting in facilities that, because they're trying to comply with best practices, really don't have the adequate programming. The purpose of juvenile court and of juvenile commitment is rehabilitation. That's the primary purpose. And along with that is intense programming in these youth prison facilities, which because of the pandemic have been severely limited because people cannot come into the facilities. And the young people who represent don't have access not only to their families to see them in person, but they don't have access on a regular basis to counseling, to therapy, to support with their education. And so there are a lot of problems, obviously the ones you would think of related to health concerns, but also related to the rehabilitation and the success of the young people who are in the prison system in New Jersey. So there's a lot of work that we've been doing in the clinic, including motions for reduction of sentences. We joined the Office of the Public Defender and the ACLU, which you'll hear about as amicus in the order to show cause, which then helped us get our clients into court faster to get them out of custody based on these motions for recall, for reduction of sentence, and then working on trying to get legislation passed to help get our clients out of custody who are sitting there with several months left on their sentence and sitting there without access to services, without access to their family, and fearful for their health and safety. I'm really so happy that we're joined today by a young advocate, Alexis Royal. And I'm going to introduce Alexis and then guide her in some questions, and she'll talk about her experience. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. As Laura said, Alexis is a youth advocate. She has been incarcerated in the Juvenile Justice Commission at 2 different facilities. The Juvenile Justice Commission has 3 secure facilities and 11 residential programs. The secure facility for females is called the Hayes Secure Female Facility, and Alexis was there for a number of years, and she also was at the Doves residential program. And actually during the pandemic, she was back and forth between both. So she has the perspective of having been in both a secure and a non-secure facility during the pandemic. And she was released after a recall motion that we filed on her behalf and was released home in July. So it's my pleasure to present to you Alexis Royal. Hi, Alexis.
Hi.
So Alexis, I think we'll just start by asking you, you were there prior to the onset of the pandemic and for several months after. How did your experience in the JJC change from before the onset of the pandemic to after, when the procedures went in place and the lockdown procedures went in place?
Well, in the Hayes facility, before everything happened, like they stopped allowing teachers to come in and all movement to stop. Before, we were actually going to the classrooms during school. We actually had like culinary. We had some college courses you could take. Some college professors will come into the building, and teach like certain classes, and we would get certifications for them at the end of them. And we would also have regular groups, like with our substance abuse counselor, with our social worker, and like just with all those type of things. At the Doves facility, we was actually allowed to like go out. If you were a graduate, you was allowed to go to Mercer County Community College. If you were enrolled, you were allowed to work. We were like actually allowed to go out and do stuff. And then once like everything, like Corona happened and they stopped everything from happening, at Doves, the teachers stopped coming in. So this was for Doves and Hayes. The teachers stopped coming in. So now they were just giving the students just work to do, and they had to like learn it on their own. So it was nobody teaching them. They just like gave them the work and was like, here, you have to have this done by this day. So that was like one of the challenges like some of the girls like struggle with, because it's like some people can't really like teach themselves. They have to like be taught by a teacher. And then like also with the counseling and stuff, they weren't allowed to come into the building at Doves or Hayes. So it was like, if we wanted to talk to someone, I mean, we could talk to a staff member, but if you wanted to see your social worker or even the substance abuse counselor, you couldn't. You had to like talk to a youth worker, which didn't really like help, because that wasn't what they were like there for. So.
And Alexis, there was a point at which there was a lockdown because there was a case of COVID in the facility. Can you describe what happened and how you felt? Scared, lonely, what was going on?
Yeah, at the Hayes facility, we actually had to quarantine for almost 2 weeks. It was probably like 10 days, because the nurse that also works, we have the same nurses that work at Hayes, and they also go across to the JMSF building. And so at JMSF, they had a couple cases because of some residents that came from another facility, which is Jamesburg. So they had cases over across the street in that building, and the same nurses were coming over to Hayes to take our temperatures, to give us our meds and stuff like that. So they were also coming in contact with us, and like, to take our temperature, you obviously can't like be 6 feet apart. So, they were all up in like on us. So there was one resident there that had like symptoms. And she also we all came in contact with this nurse. She also came in contact with the nurse, and she was having symptoms of COVID-19. So they quarantined everybody, and it later was found that he had COVID, and fortunately the girl didn't. But it was just scary, because it's like, we're like, here, we have no choice but to be here, and we're like trusting, the officers, the nurses, the social workers, everyone, to make sure we're safe. And it's like, you guys are bringing this in the building, and it's like, we have no cases, but now it's like, you guys are working in the Corona unit across the street, but then coming over here where there's no cases, it's kind of like, it's scary, because you never know. One day you can be okay, the next minute, like the next day, you could be just sick. And it's like, it's not our fault, because we're not the ones going out. So, it's just kind of scary. It's just like all like, yeah.
And were officers or others communicating to you about what was happening in the world with COVID? How did you find out what was going on?
Well, at first I heard about it through a magazine, but it wasn't really like such a big topic. It was like probably December 2019 of it in China. And so then later, like towards like February of 2020, I was like, went back to Hayes, and I was like, I found out that it was like it's such a big thing. We weren't allowed to watch the news. So the officers were kind of like, did you hear about this? Did you hear about that? And we're like, no. And some of the officers, would want to know what's going on, because if they were there early in the morning, they would like want to watch the news. So, we just like watched the news whenever they did. So we would watch the news, and then, see that the cases was rising, how many deaths was happening. And obviously it showed like, it compared and contrasted from the different states, I'm sorry. And so we seen like in New Jersey that it was like really high, and we were just like, wow, like, you know, this could easily be like happening to me, but like, thank God it's not. But it's just like, that was just like, you know, it's scary because, you know, we don't really know what's going on out there because no one like tells us. We wouldn't really know if it wasn't like, you know, for the news, like the TV and stuff like that, because they try to tell us so they don't scare us. And I feel like that's like not right, because it's like, you know, obviously we want to make sure we're good with our health and stuff. So yeah, it's kind of scary.
Alexis, to give everyone a little background, you're talking about the Hayes facility, which at the onset of the pandemic had, I think, about 15 or 16 young women housed there, and around today, I think there's 9. With that number, can you describe, you know, what kind of space you have, and were you able to social distance? Were you able to wear gear to feel safe? How did you feel with that?
Okay, so we were obviously, you know, we had to wear the mask. They gave us like different 2 masks a week, so we like recycled our mask. And so with it being, the building is not that big for like, you know, to house such like a lot of women. Also during during COVID, like for us to social distance is not really like they don't have the space for it. So when we like had to kind of, we tried to, but it just wasn't like, you know, just physically wasn't possible, because if I sat right here, somebody had to sit right here, and then there was a chair right there. So it was just, you know, we couldn't really like social distance as we were supposed to, because, you know, the building is not that big. It's like not made for something like this to happen. Also, even at the Doves facility, it's like a house. So it's like all the couches are right next to each other. And at the time it was probably like, I think also like a little over like, I think it was like 6-7 girls. So it's like, how are you like wanting us to social distance? And it's like, even at the Doves facility, you know, the girls didn't wear the mask, the staff didn't wear the mask. So it was kind of like, and the staff is the ones that's like, you know, in the world, like it's not us. So it's like, if anything, you guys are bringing this in here, you guys aren't wearing the mask. So it was kind of like, you know, yeah.
How did that make you feel when you kind of knew what was going on, but it was out of your control, but then you had people coming in with that masks? What did that make you feel like?
At Doves, I said something a couple times, because I remember one of the staff members like made like a smart remark like, oh, you guys are supposed to be wearing your masks and social distancing anyway. And I'm like, okay, but you guys aren't wearing your mask either, and we're not the ones that's like, you know, like with the real world, that's like, you guys are more at risk than we are, because you guys are the one that's going out there, going to the stores and stuff like that. We're in here with y'all. So if anything, we was to get this, it wouldn't be our fault. It would clearly be you guys. So she would like try to say like, well, if we didn't want to get it, stay away from her, or stay, like, because we're supposed to be 6 feet. So she's trying to like, I'm like, okay, but we're supposed to wear masks regardless if we're this close, or regardless we're this close, we're still supposed to have them on. And so it was just kind of like, you know, I feel like if you spoke about it, they would like kind of like, you know, give you like a smart remark about it. So it was kind of like, okay, like you're mad because I want to make sure I'm okay, and like that I don't get this, and it's like something serious. It's not nothing to play around. Like there were so many people passing away from this, and it was just like, you guys are like just taking it as a joke, trying to be funny, and like it's not a joke.
Alexis, during this time, what kind of communication did you have with your family, and how did that differ from before the pandemic?
Okay, so in the beginning at the Doves facility, we were allowed visits twice a week. My mother came only once a week, and then we were allowed 3 phone calls a week. So at the Doves facility, when after COVID happened and they canceled visits, they were allowing us to have 2 Skype calls a week, and they gave us 1 extra phone call. So we had 4 phone calls and then 2 Skype calls at Doves. At the Hayes secure facility, there was originally only 2 phone calls a week, and there was 2 visits also, but they ended up changing only to 1 Skype call, which was for like 25 or 30 minutes. And then they gave us 2 extra phone calls. So then we also have 4 phone calls. So it was kind of like, I kind of felt kind of lonely, because I was one of those that my mom came to see me every single week. So I had to get used to like not seeing her for like months. So it was just like, you know, like, when is this gonna stop? Because like, I want to see my mom. She was like my biggest like supporter when I was there. So it was like, you know, that's like, yeah, I wanted to see her so bad. And even like the other people would say they want to see their families, and it was like they didn't get the chance to, because, you know, everything that was going on. And it was just kind of like heartbreaking, because it's like, you know, you miss your family when you're in a place like that. You don't get to see them every day, like, you know, if you were home So it was like the chance that I do get, I can't have it. So it was kind of like, yeah.
And Alexis, you know, you're talking with your family, you're trying to get home, and you had about, I think, 7 or 8 months left on your sentence when we got involved with your case. And up until then, you had been meeting with parole, right?
Yeah.
And just for the audience, in November, because of S-48, I know Senator Poe's here, the parole will change significantly in New Jersey, so it'll look a lot different, and the JJC will be involved, and we're hoping that more youth will get released. But when you were there, you were meeting with the parole panel, and you did meet with them at one point during the pandemic. Can you describe what that parole hearing was like, and if they brought up the pandemic at all in you know, talking about your case?
Okay, so during when I went to parole February 2020, and this was when I went back to, and this was, we actually seen them face to face physically. And so then I had to see them again in another 3 months, which was May 2020. And this time I was already back at Hayes. So I went back to Hayes, you know, because like I requested, it was on my own. So I like was at Hayes, and I was in, they didn't actually come because, you know, this is when they shut down everything, you know, people couldn't come in, we could, you know, yeah. So we had a Skype call with parole, and the only thing he like asked me was, why are you back at Hayes? And I'm just like, you know, because first Doves just wasn't where I wanted to be, just because like my emotional and like physical mental state. So that it wasn't nothing to do with my behavior or anything. So I just was like, you know, because I told him why, and he was just like, oh, well, like you don't need to be at, and I was a graduate. So, and you know, at Doves, you can go to college and stuff, but COVID stopped everything. So I wasn't doing anything there anyway. So I'm like, I mean, I'm not doing anything. So, you know, I just like would rather be here because it's just like I have more support with like the doctors and social workers and stuff like that. So he's just like, oh, well, I don't want you there. So yeah, we're going to take off 0 days, and that's that. And so I'm just like, okay, like he didn't ask me like anything about COVID. He didn't ask if, you know, social distance. He didn't like really care about none of that. And it was a matter of probably like 5 minutes. And it was just like, okay, well, we're done. Well, here you have 0 days your paper's going to come in the mail, and that's that. And I was just like, you know, I can't say nothing because that's like, you know, the parole. So I was just like, okay, I'll see you again in another 3 months. Like, so I was just like, you know, it's like he didn't really care. So.
Alexis, thank you so much. I think we're out of time. I'm sorry. I think we went over. I just want to just end by saying that because parole denied Alexis release and didn't account for the pandemic, we got involved and were able to file a recall motion on her behalf in court. And she was released on that recall motion, which was accelerated because of the order to show cause. And her mom, in a very dramatic event, drove to the facility at midnight to get her out so they wouldn't hold her over the weekend. And we're so happy that she's home and doing well, and is going to be a great force and advocate for other youth who are there. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks to both of you. And Alexis, you should know 2 things. Number one, there have been comments in the chat about what a powerful advocate you are. And second, for everybody else who's with us today, this has been Alexis's first time telling her story publicly. And you are just going to be such an amazing advocate, an amazing force. And we thank you for sharing with us what I know was a really painful time in your life. So thank you.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I'd like to turn it over now to Jessica Fireman, who will give us a sense of what's happening nationally with regard to youth in the legal system and the prison system during the time of COVID. Jessica is with the Juvenile Law Center in Philadelphia. Juvenile Law Center is a national force on the youth justice front, and they have been, and specifically Jessica has been, an amazing partner for us in New Jersey over many, many years. She oversees Juvenile Law Center's projects and programs. She engages in litigation, amicus curiae briefs, policy advocacy. She is an extraordinary advocate. She has changed life for the better for youth all over this country, and it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome Jessica with us today.
Thank you, Laura. Can you see my screen also?
Yes. Yes.
That's great. Well, I have changed my screen for the better, so there's that. I just want to echo what the thanks to Alexis. That was amazing. I hope this is the beginning of a long and rich advocacy career for you. It's just your words are powerful and you're such an effective, brilliant speaker. So thanks for launching us. Oh no, now can I make the, there we go. So I don't think I really need to go through this. The speakers on today already have really clarified why is it so wrong for young people or for anyone to be in a facility during COVID. Can't physically distance, no ventilation, staff are coming in and out, which is increasing the risk. And for young people, but also for adults, we're hearing a lot of stories of when the facility can't manage the pandemic, they're relying on solitary confinement, which raises a whole other host of issues. Young people stuck in a cell by themselves in what's already a really stressful situation. And you already heard about the loss of programming and education. So if you're supposed to be in the justice system to get a program, that's not what's happening right now. There are then a set of medical challenges in facilities. No testing or insufficient testing is one that we've heard about a lot. In one of our cases, we had an outbreak of COVID among young people. About 29 out of 30 tested positive, and then the facility decided not to test any further, but only to test people who were clearly symptomatic. So real problems with not knowing the extent of an outbreak in youth facilities. And of course, youth facilities aren't set up for quarantine purposes, don't have the medical capacity. I just want to share a little more context then about what does this look like. This is thanks to the Sentencing Project. These are the cases that have been confirmed. So again, when we had those 29 cases, they stopped testing. There are many, many more youth cases around the country of COVID that haven't been caught and that are causing risks to other young people, but also to staff and also to the community. So you see this data ended at end of August and was up at 1,750 for the number of young people with confirmed cases, and staff numbers even higher. Staff may be able to get tests outside of facilities, so I think we expect that there would be more confirmed cases, but of course there are many fewer staff members than youth, so that suggests that there again are many, many more cases of COVID in facilities. So what do we do about it? Young people around the country have been speaking up and saying, free the youth. This is a member of Youth Justice Coalition in California. They had a Free the Youth rally, but really secure facilities are not safe places generally and are not really conducive to positive change. But during a pandemic, they're even worse. So our real goal now has just been, what can we do to bring young people home to their families, to their communities where they'll be safer? I want to share a quick smattering of court decisions. This isn't all the court decisions. Some of these are cases that we worked on at Juvenile Law Center. Others are ones that our colleagues worked on. The courts haven't really been in impact litigation and systemic litigation on behalf of young people. Have not been as proactive as we would have liked. A lot of us, there was a wonderful moment of people supporting each other at the beginning of the pandemic, lawyers supporting each other, experts giving their advice for free, because we knew that the most important thing to do was to get young people out of facilities as fast as possible. Courts have been really reluctant to rule the conditions unconstitutional to the point of releasing young people. So in California, the court said, it was a California Supreme Court said it was troubled by the accounts that there wasn't any physical distancing, but from what they could see, it didn't amount to a constitutional violation. And part of the issue there was what kind of evidence was available. And of course, communication between folks on the inside and the outside is really challenging right now. So harder than ever to have full information about what's happening. In Maryland, advocates filed with the Supreme Court again saying young people can't be safe in the facility for all of these reasons that we just talked about. The court officially rejected the petition, but a couple of days later, the Supreme Court issued guidance that judges should limit detention and confinement of youth unless it was necessary to protect youth safety or the safety of others. And almost immediately after that, about 200 young people were released, and I think a few hundred more have been released since then in a state that has a pretty small juvenile justice population. So good progress there, even though the twists and turns of what the court is willing to say or not say have been a little unclear. We had a similar outcome here in Pennsylvania. We filed right away saying, please let young people go home. This pandemic is not good for anyone. Young people are safer at home. There are real constitutional violations. People don't have cleaning supplies. They can't social distance. It's just not safe. And the Supreme Court said, we're not taking the special jurisdiction that you asked us to take, but it did direct the courts, the president judges of our lower courts around the state to review placements and to think about removing kids. And we have also seen, I think we started the pandemic with about 2,200 young people in placement, both in detention and after their hearings in post-adjudication placement. And we now have about 1,500. So a really significant decline. I want to kind of share, it's not enough. There are far too many young people still locked up, but I do want to share the good news. Things are changing for the better in some ways. Louisiana, this is another one we worked on. And you know, this is the place where they weren't testing despite a clear outbreak. And the federal court said that the juvenile justice actions were not just okay, but commendable. So that was a tough decision to hear. The silver lining here was that in preparation, or seemingly in preparation for the litigation, a lot of changes were made. So they were, prior to that, using pepper spray against young people, which we were extremely concerned about. We don't know what the interaction would be for a young person with COVID who is pepper sprayed. They stopped doing that, and they did resume the in-person instruction. So what we were just talking about before, that there's something to do during the day. So some changes there. I just wanted to share a couple of graphs from Annie E. Casey Foundation that reiterate this point, that really we have many fewer young people around the country in facilities than we did before the pandemic. And that's an important moment, both in how do we respond to a pandemic, and also can we safely operate our systems without locking young people up. So here you can see some drops from January to March in detention, and also some increase in releases. So young people who were already in a facility are being released home. The data will continue to change. What we're worried about and what we want to fight against is the kind of uptick that we started to see here between May and June. And one other key point, obviously we have really severe racial disparities in our juvenile justice system, as we do in our criminal justice system. This is due to centuries of racism, real problems in bias that's just in our system that all of us have, and that are impacting who gets placed in juvenile justice facilities. So as we look at who's getting released, we also want to keep track of what's happening along lines of race. Excuse me. And here you can see what's happening is that all youth are being released more during the pandemic, but white youth are being released more readily than Black youth. And so we're increasing rather than decreasing our disparities. Quick additional point that I want to talk about, which is one set of issues we're working on, is what happens to young people in facilities. Another set of problems that the justice system can impose are economic ones. So the youth and families in many states are being charged fees or fines when they're in the justice system. Excuse me. And as we know, right now is a tough time economically for folks. And so we're very worried about the impact of these fees and fines. The great news, thanks to S48, which I think we are going to hear a little more about, is that in New Jersey, there are no longer fines being imposed, and that's a huge step in the right direction. We're worried around the country that courts and justice agencies are actually going to try to increase reliance in fees and fines because they too are facing budget shortfalls. more good news. So in addition to New Jersey, 4 other states have recently passed legislation to abolish either fees or fines. And that's a trend that we hope we will keep pushing for, and we hope to see more of, both eliminating additional fines, fees in New Jersey, but also fines and financial penalties other places where we'll be able to point to all the good work that's already happened in New Jersey. And at this moment during COVID, a number of state Supreme Courts have also said, let's put a moratorium on fees because people just don't have the money to pay. So there's some good news tucked in there. And I think this is a moment where we in the youth justice advocacy community really want to capture the gains that we've seen in more young people coming home, but recognize that even if we've reduced the population by 1/4, that leaves us 3/4 to go. We really want young people at home. We need to address racial disparities, look at them, see what's happening, and tackle them. Obviously, for those young people who are left, improve conditions and eliminate fines and fees. I had to give a shout out to New Jersey Institute for Social Justice for their the good work, but also their beautiful graphic. I just thought this was so powerful. 150 years is enough. The real answer to our problems is not going to be in facilities. It's going to be in supporting communities and supporting young people. And so that's a direction that I think we're poised to go, both in New Jersey and across the country. And I probably talked way too quickly, but there was a lot I wanted to say, and I'm really glad to have had a chance to talk with all of you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. We did have one request in the chat for your slides. Would you be willing to share them? So
Sure.
What we'll do is, if you don't mind sending them to me, I'll circulate them to all the participants.
Absolutely.
Thank you. That was really, really great. So to give us a national perspective, I want to turn things over to Todd Clear. Todd is a university professor of criminal justice and currently also on our law school faculty. He has previously served as the provost of Rutgers University in Newark, and before that, dean of the School of Criminal Justice. He previously held a professorship at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. He is a prolific writer and scholar. He is a nationally and internationally known expert in incarceration and many other aspects of criminal justice. And we're thrilled to welcome him here today.
Thank you, Laura. And let me start by saying how moved I am by the stories. People who do what I do spend a lot of our time in offices, and the things that are happening in people's lives, the events that are happening in people's lives really matter enormously. And I think it's important that we started with those stories. I would like to say that my hope and my prayer is that we are in a moment where, in confronting the pandemic, we will also at the same time confront the problem that we have faced in the United States, that we have created a reliance on the prison system that is unhealthy for us, for our communities, and for our justice system, and has not achieved for us the kinds of things that we want to achieve in the field of criminal justice. I want to, Laura started off with some figures. The law school at UCLA is keeping data as well, and I was visiting their website this morning. The numbers they have are slightly different, but I want to identify a couple of things that they have there that are to me extremely shocking. One is that the rate of positive tests of people inside the prison system is 30%. If you watch the television sometimes, as I do, you learn that anything above 2% or 3% is considered to be a crisis. The prison system of the United States is a continuing catastrophe of illness. It has been that for a long time, but the pandemic is providing us with the direct evidence of the kinds of the kind of thing that we do to people when we mistreat them through the incarceration system that we've built. 9%, currently the numbers that you heard, about 9% of the US prison population, adult prison population is tested positive. And now again, if you go to the New York Times website and you look at the worst places in the US, the places that have the highest rates, most of them have prisons, but none of them are much above 10% of the population of those places testing positive. So what we have with the entire prison system in the United States is a location that we have created that matches what we would think of in the free community as being the most disastrously affected places in the country. This is talking about people who are incarcerated in the system. Staff numbers are also bad, but according to the UCLA data, more than 2/3 of the staff who get tested test positive. So we've created not only a place that's unhealthy for the people that that are forced to go there, but it's a place that is unhealthy as well for the people who we pay to go there. Currently in the United States, there's almost 50,000 people who are under quarantine while in prison. Now, if you can just imagine that, they're incarcerated and at the same time they're under quarantine. It is almost unimaginable kind of infliction upon that we would do on the people who are incarcerated there. Only 7,000 people have been released nationally directly as a result of a release memoranda related to COVID. That's less than 5% of those who've tested positive. So we have failed enormously to rise to the challenge that's in front of us. The New Jersey numbers, which you heard again from Laura, are stunning. We are about 1 out of 5 of the people who we incarcerate in New Jersey have tested positive, and that's even after we have, as you've heard, slowed down our testing rate. The rate of people dying among those who are incarcerated in New Jersey is the highest in the nation, not the number, but the rate. And we in New Jersey have been given plenty of mechanisms by which we can release people, and we've not been doing it. I want to say a few things about why I think this might be a moment which might help us to face not just our responsibility in a time of an international pandemic, but also at a time when we are ourselves asking whether what we have done with the US prison system is the kind of thing we want to do it in a free democratic society. We've been growing our prison system for almost 50 years. In 1972, we had, thinking about this historically, we had about 200,000 people incarcerated in the United States. We now have more than that many people serving life sentences. Between 1972 and 2010, the number of people being incarcerated increased by eightfold. The rate by 5-fold. We grew the prison system no matter what was going on, whether we were at war, at peace, good economic times, bad. We put more people in prison and made them stay there longer. What's interesting about New Jersey as a special case is that New Jersey has had the largest drop in its prison population since its peak year in the United States, but that has happened at the same time we've had a growth in the racial disparity of our prison population, and while we have the largest drop in the number of people in the rate of people incarcerated in the United States, we also have the largest racial disparity in our incarceration rates in the United States. And we don't need to do that. I was recently asked to think about the kinds of questions that are being asked of us by the pandemic. And in particular, Governor Murphy put together an executive order calling for a series of procedures to try to identify people who could be released from prison as a result of this pandemic. And the one of the criteria was age. And I want to say that there's a great deal of research on age and public safety. We know that people over the age of 45 have much lower rates of new criminal behavior than people under the age of 45. And so the idea that we continue to hold people long after it's useful for us to have them in prison is one of the most important ideas that we can face here. A recent paper published in Notre Dame Law Review looked at folks who were released over the age from a cohort of releasees from New York and California over the age of 55, and found that only 3% of them returned to prison within 3 years. So if we said we had to keep them in prison because we had to be safe from them, in fact, we were keeping them in prison when we were already safe from them. And most of the people who are being talked about, and we heard stories about this earlier, about being released from prison, are very close to their release date anyway. So what does the research tell us about releasing people 6 months, 9 months, 8 months earlier than we ordinarily would do? There have now been at least a half dozen very recent studies that have looked exactly at this question. They all come out in the same place. They're different methodologies, different databases, different places where the studies have been done. They all find that somewhere between a 6 month and a 9 month reduction in length of stay has no impact on likelihood of going to of getting involved in criminal behavior again. And so, and as a result, we are holding people longer, again, to our detriment. And for people who need to be released from prison because they're unsafe for health reasons of being in prison, and they're within a few months of their release date, there's literally no public safety argument that can be made for keeping them in prison to complete their sentences. And finally, we've heard a lot, and I'm particularly interested in the issue of people serving time for violent crime. We've heard a lot of concerns about, well, you're letting people out of prison who are quote, violent, close quote. And I want to say that the research on this is extremely consistent and extremely important. Again, this Notre Dame Law Review article that just came out that I referred to looked at 3,000 people convicted of homicide who were released from prisons in New York and California, and found that that three of them were back in prison within 3 years for a new homicide. 3 out of 3,000. The arrest rate in New Jersey's own data, the arrest rate of people released from prison over the age of 45 is 1/3 the arrest rate of people under the age of 45. People convicted of violent crimes, the arrest rate of people 3 years out on New Jersey's own data is 1/3 the rate of the arrest rate of people who are released from prison on other kinds of offenses. So we create this big wall around people who are serving time for violent crime, and it's an irrational wall because, in fact, it is not a public safety wall. It's a self-delusional wall. About 24% of the New Jersey prison population is produced by how we sentence people for robbery. If we reduced the length of, and robbery, by the way, is one of those crimes where if you're a person of color, the kinds of sentence enhancements that can happen to you you're particularly vulnerable for. If we reduce the length of stay for robbery by a few months, we would reduce the overall prison population in the state of New Jersey by significant percentages. So COVID is a tragedy in the prison system, but for us, it is an opportunity to ask ourselves, do we need to have this prison system of this size and of this scope? And I am hoping, by the way, we've had 7,000 people released nationally. We had, in New Jersey, we've had 600 people released in the juvenile justice system. We will learn, when we look at those numbers, we will learn the public safety impact of those releases was essentially zero. I recently modeled for the Marshall Project some of the arrest probabilities using current data about arrest probabilities for people released from prison. If you let out everybody who was over the age of 55, everybody who had who was within 6 months of their current release date, and everybody who had a compromising health condition, and they were arrested at the rate that we have the ordinary samples arrested with, what would it mean for the United States? And it would be, we would see less than a 2% increase in the arrest rate in the United States. We could reduce, and by the way, it wouldn't mean that we would be less safe in that time period, because these are all arrests that are just happening earlier. They're arrests that would have happened 6 months from now anyway, and now they're just happening now. And 6 months from now, they won't happen, so we're even safer 6 months down the road. So the point is, COVID is the opportunity for us to learn the lessons we need to learn about why we don't have to have this huge prison system, by comparison to the rest of the world, an enormous prison system that has been detrimental for communities, for racial justice, and for the health of the nation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Todd. There's so much to learn there, and you know, throughout this entire 6 month time of awfulness, I've been looking for silver linings. I think a lot of us have been looking for silver linings. And if one of those silver linings could possibly be that we finally reach a collective consensus around fixing the prison system or annihilating the prison system, then I think we would all be in a better place. I know that there are some questions in the chat, but I'm a little bit worried about time. So what I'd like to do is move on, and hopefully we'll be able to grab a couple minutes at the end and come back to some of those questions. But if the speakers want to respond to the questions in the chat, that would also be great. So next I'd like to turn it over to the folks who have been doing really tireless and phenomenal work on the ground in New Jersey at every, in every branch of government. One of the things that we've learned from the pandemic and from efforts to liberate people is that there's no one branch of government that has the ability or the desire to take action alone. And so the advocates who have been working around the state have had to advocate in the legislature, they've had to advocate in the courts, and they've had to engage in administrative advocacy. And what we're going to do now is hear a little bit about those efforts, where they've brought us, and what is still left to be done. We're going to start with Alex Shalom and Joe Cricora. Joe Cricora is the public defender for the state of New Jersey and is in the middle of his second term. He has built a reputation for the agency as one of the best public defender offices in the country. He has been with the OPD for over 34 years and has held numerous positions within the agency during that time, including Director of Capital Defense at a time when New Jersey still had the death penalty. He's joined by Alex Shalom, who is the senior, I'm going to muff his title, I know, but he is the Senior Policy Counsel and Director of Supreme Court Litigation, I believe, at the ACLU of New Jersey. Alex is a powerful voice in New Jersey around all aspects of civil liberties, and particularly with regard to transforming both the criminal and juvenile legal systems. He is himself a former public defender, and Joe and Alex are going to share with us some of the litigation efforts they've made around obtaining releases for folks during the pandemic.
Thanks, Laura. I'm mindful that we're running over time a little bit, and I certainly want everyone to get to hear from my legislative hero, Senator Poe, so that was a clever way for Laura to make sure that Joe and I stayed on time, as putting Senator Poe after us. So Joe's given me, in a rare act of grace, has let me talk a little bit about our first efforts, which were probably our most successful in the court space, and he'll then take the latter. So Joe and I started talking early in March, before, I can't think of the polite way to say the shit hit the fan, but before then, about what we could do to forestall what everyone knew, what every single expert had said was going to be a disaster when COVID got into our prisons and our jails. And we actually first started thinking about the jails, 20 or so of them around the state. And we knew that there was dramatic action that needed to be taken. And so it's worth just quickly reminding people who was in our jails. So in 2012, there were 15,000 people in our jails, and they were both people who were held pre-trial and people serving really short sentences of less than a year, but typically around 5 months, for things ranging from shoplifting to DWI to simple assault or possession of marijuana. Through, again, efforts led by Joe's office in the Office of the Public Defender, that number of people has reduced dramatically, such that when we started thinking about this in the beginning of March, there were about 9,000 people in our jails around the state. We came up with this crazy idea that we would go to the court and say, look, court, we understand that in the pre-trial space, it's all very individualized, and you have to make individual decisions about each person, about the risk that they might pose to public safety. But everyone who's been sentenced, who's serving a sentence in jail, is going to be a lower risk person because we didn't send them to prison. We sent them to jail for these short sentences. So whether they should serve those sentences or not serve them, they shouldn't serve them now because no one got a sentence of death. And we need to do things to protect people. And the easiest way to do that is to say, let's let everyone out who's serving a sentence. And then when the pandemic is over, we'll figure out if they have to go back in to finish it. And we came up with this idea that we were just going to write to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and say, hey, why don't you issue an order that does this for everyone? And it was admittedly a bit of a Hail Mary, but Joe and I had some success working with the Chief Justice and other stakeholders like the Attorney General and the County Prosecutors Association. And so on March 19th, we sent a letter, Joe sent an email to the chief late at night saying, hey, would you enter this order? And the next morning, the chief signed an order sending Joe and me and the county prosecutors and the Attorney General to mandatory arbitration, mediation with a retired judge, Judge Karchman. And he said, look, if you guys can't work it out, we're going to have briefs and we're going to have arguments, and that'll be on Tuesday or Wednesday. This was on a Friday night Friday that he did it. And we got together, and to the credit of the Attorney General and the County Prosecutors Association, we reached an agreement on a consent order that was going to set up a mechanism that basically said, let's let everybody out unless the prosecutors come up with a good reason why they shouldn't be let out, in which case we'll have a court decide whether they should or shouldn't. And that was signed on the 22nd of March. So 3 days later, we had this consent order signed. And through the tireless work of the attorneys in Joe's office, and I'm just stressing this because it drives me crazy when people give public defenders a hard time. But if I told you how many calls I had with public defenders after 10 p.m. in March and April, you wouldn't believe me. But tireless and wildly effective work. And so within a week of the consent order being signed, 697 people were released from New Jersey jails as a direct result of that consent order. And that doesn't take into account the people who got out through individual advocacy. But just look, and this is my last sentence here, and I'll pass it to Joe. But the population in the beginning of March was 8,933. And at the end of March, it was 6,875, a 23% reduction in the population in under a month. And if we go back to 2012, to before bail reform, the jail population was cut in more than half. That is unbelievable. And then it was all downhill from there, and I'll leave that to Joe to talk about that.
Yeah, I can rain on your parade, Alex. So the first part is, since the point in time that Alex just focused on, where the jail populations were down 25%, since that time, and by the way, it did have a dramatic positive impact on protecting people in the jails, because unlike in the prisons, we just didn't see the kind of rate of infection and spread of the virus in the county jails that we have seen in the state prison system. But unfortunately, since then, every day judges are ordering more pretrial defendants into detention. There's no grand juries. There are no jury trials being conducted. So the number of people in the county jails is increasing at an alarming rate. And now, unfortunately, 4 or 5 months later, whatever it's been, the number of people in the county jails is just about back to what it was before we made those Herculean efforts in March to get 2,000 people out with different mechanisms. So we have now started in the public defender's office, and Alex is in on this, collaborating again, the ACLU, a new project, which is to go into court on behalf of hundreds and hundreds of detained defendants. In fact, we have 2,200 clients just in the public defender's office, and asking judges to reconsider these detention orders, because it's getting to the point now where the benefits of what we did back in March and April have faded into oblivion. But let me focus, and Alex and I kind of broke down our discussion. The other big piece of litigation that we have engaged in over the last few months pertains to state prison inmates. And as many of you know, back in April, Governor Murphy signed an executive order, the purpose of which was to identify categories of inmates, people with underlying conditions, people over 60, and people who were about to be released in the near future anyway, and people who had been recently denied parole. And the thrust of his order was to the Department of Corrections, release these individuals, and there were close to 3,000 who were eligible out of the 16 to 18,000, I forget the exact number in our prisons. Release these individuals. It was sort of analogous to the consent order that Alex described. The idea being, governor says to Commissioner Hicks, release these 3,000 unless there's a good reason why they pose such a risk to public safety that they can't be released. So what happened? Well, that was in April. It's now September. And the Commissioner of the Department of Corrections has made a mockery of the governor's order. Last time I checked, there were about 300 something people on home furlough. And by the way, this idea was not that your sentence is forever commuted. It's just that during the public health emergency, you are sent to home furlough so as to reduce the number of people in prisons and all the benefits that flow from that in terms of protecting people from COVID-19. So he had just denied, for almost incomprehensible reasons, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of inmates who are eligible under the governor's order to be released to home furlough. And the parole board, for its part, has not reconsidered the parole eligibility of any of these folks as ordered by the governor. And when they do, they actually took the position that they could not change the new parole eligibility date, even though at the same time, the parole board is saying, we're reconsidering the decision. We should have released this guy. We should release him, but we can't do it now. So the whole thing has been a complete disaster. I think that's the only word you can use. We went to the Supreme Court in June with another order to show cause, essentially saying, court, you have to do something. The Department of Corrections is making a mockery of the executive order. The inmates have no rights. They have no right to appeal when the commissioner denies them. They have no voice whatsoever. They don't have representation. And out of that, we made some progress because the court acknowledged, based on our arguments, that these inmates had due process rights, that once the governor issued the order for their release, potential release, they had the right. So now they have a right to appeal back to the commissioner to provide additional information, and they have the ability to go to the appellate division and appeal if the commissioner denied them improperly. And we set up a hotline and an email address, and we have now represented over 1,100 inmates, just trying to help them get what they're entitled to under the executive order. It's been excruciating work because we meet with roadblocks every day from the Attorney General's office representing the parole board and the DOC. But we had a major victory last week when, based on our arguments on behalf of one of these inmates who had been denied both home furlough by Commissioner Hicks and parole by the parole board, told that he had to wait until December, even though they were positively ruling on his reconsideration of parole. Based on convincing, I think, the governor's office that that was wrong, and one court ruling, they released 70 inmates on the same day last week with approvals from Hicks, which was like a monumental victory for us, even though in the total scheme of things, it's really nothing considering how many people he denied. So it's really unfortunate that there was a mechanism put in place by the governor back in April, which would have had a dramatic impact, positive impact on the ability of our prison system to protect both the inmates and the staff. Unfortunately, the DOC through the commissioner basically thumbed his nose at it. You know, why the governor didn't step in and more or less tell his hand-picked commissioner of Department of Corrections to do what he asked him to do by executing and implementing this order in the spirit and legality that was designed to accomplish is beyond me, but that's what happened. And so that has made the situation in our state prison system worse than it really ever needed to be, and would have been had the commissioner acted in the right spirit in terms of these releases. And I'll end on this note. It was some of the decisions by the commissioner were so inexplicable that you had people in halfway houses. And trust me, this is not uncommon. We had a number of clients like this. in a halfway house, having already been deemed so low risk and so close to the end of his or her sentence, that these are inmates that are living in a halfway house, permitted to go into the community, go to school, go to jobs, right? Now, suddenly, not only can they not leave their halfway house due to the shutdown of the pandemic, but there's somehow people who shouldn't be released to home confinement for the duration of the public emergency. Inmates already deemed so low risk that they have been granted permission to live and work in a halfway house for the remaining months of their sentence. So pretty discouraging, but I will say, as a pat our own lawyers on the back, and I see Christina smiling, our lawyers just went above and beyond trying to help these inmates. And you know, one of the positives that has come out of it is, I think people and their inmates and their family members, their loved ones, you know, they know that there's at least somebody trying to help them. And that's, I can't tell you how many, you know, emails or calls we've had from family members just to the effect, or responses to our lawyers, just like, hey, you know, I know it didn't work out, but I just want you to thank you for fighting for my son or trying to help my brother. And that's gratifying, but it doesn't help get our clients out of prison. So Alex and I had a good news, bad news presentation, Laura.
Thanks so much to both of you. And a couple of things, I can vouch for the intrepid advocacy that public defenders all over the state are doing on behalf of individual clients, and the impact that it's made on the systemic work that we're all trying to do together. One of the things that has become, I think, painfully clear through all of this is that the courts are not necessarily the haven we hoped they would be, and that we have had to turn our attention to the legislature and try to also engage in this work there. And there is no greater champion of this work. There is no better advocate on behalf of incarcerated people. There is no better legislative maven in this state when it comes to criminal and youth justice issues than Senator Nellie Poe. Senator Poe is the president-elect of the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators. She has served in the New Jersey State Legislature since 1997. She's chaired the New Jersey Legislative Latino Caucus since 2006. And she has had leadership positions throughout her time in our state Senate. I've had the great privilege of working with Senator Poe over the last 6 or 7 years on a number of legislative initiatives. She has been a stalwart advocate for people who are vulnerable, people who are living in difficult situations, people who are incarcerated, and everyone across our state who is in need. And it is such an honor to welcome her here today.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so very much for that beautiful introduction. Let me just say, before I begin to just share some of my remarks, I just want to make mention of the fact that there's been no greater I don't want to use the word pleasure, but there's been no greater opportunity for me, or just thought of doing the kind of work that I am now doing, that I've been doing for a number of years, than making sure that we try to address this very population, and see that we're able to do that in a way that is gratifying to all. We have a lot more work to do, and we will certainly continue to do that. But thank you so very much for those very kind and beautiful words. I just want to thank you for the invitation. I want to thank Dean Lopez once again for, I saw that he was on earlier. I want to just also make mention of the fact that, and thank them for their heartfelt, emotional comments that were shared earlier by Ms. Parks, Scott Clemens, from the young woman, Alexis Royal, who is the youth that spoke beautifully. And I totally agree that she certainly is will be something to be reckoned with. She is absolutely amazing, and just listening to her, and so impressed that it was her first time ever to do this. So it doesn't get any better than that. So thank you so very much. I want to also thank, and I've had the opportunity to working with so many people on this panel, so I feel like I'm part of the family here. Welcoming feeling each and every time. But I also want to I want to share some information for all the law students that are on this wonderful conference, virtual conference. So once again, thank you. As I've pointed out, it's an honor to be with all of you. And I am so grateful that technology affords us the opportunity to continue to have these meaningful discussions, even though we can safely convene all together. We cannot safely convene all together in a seminar room or a banquet hall like we used to way back in 2019. When you think about it, it was only just last year. But we are blessed to have freedom to adhere to the CDC guidelines, to social distancing, to avoid large groups when eating, working, exercising, and socializing. That is not the case, however, for inmates in jails and prisons, as you've heard many of the speakers before me make mention of. The standard American prison is almost a perfect antithesis to our safety guidelines in this pandemic. Overcrowded and underfunded with minimum access to health care, that can lead to nothing but disruption. That's really why we are all here today, to listen to what is going on. At the onset of the pandemic, as soon as we saw this highly contagious disease had reached New Jersey shores, knowing the inability for inmates to properly protect themselves, I, along with many of you who are on this panel and some of my other legislative colleagues, began urging the government to commute sentences of inmates already nearing the completion of their sentences. The idea being we can thin the population inside, allow for greater social distancing, and ultimately keep everyone safer. The inmates, the guards, and all other prison staff. After all, the state sentenced these men, women, and juveniles to punish them for breaking the law, not to kill them. When the governor's initial executive order to grant early release to certain offenders seemed to stall in the DOC during implementation, you just heard Joe Cricora talk about that. We knew that the legislature needed to act in order to get these men and women out of harm's way. The bill that I crafted along with many of you that you've already spoken, I've worked so very closely with many of you, along with some of my other terrific colleagues, in response to the crisis had passed the Senate, but is still waiting approval in the Assembly. S-2519 would create a system by which in the event of public health emergency being declared to a communicable or infectious disease, inmates, including juveniles, would be awarded 4 months off their sentence for every month served during the emergency. And I believe that Todd Clare just talked about the importance of just a few months, the release of that, the difference that will make in terms of our population in the prison. This is exactly the kind of thing that we're trying to achieve here. But S-2519, as I mentioned, although it's been cleared through the Senate, it is still waiting for final passage in the Assembly. The second bill that we passed, now law, to bring some relief to juveniles and juvenile facility was S-2511. And S-2511, let me just say, thank you, Laura, for all the work that you helped in making sure that that was something that we worked on and recognized, and I'm happy to say that this legislation really makes a difference. This legislation really just simply accelerated some of the provisions in my previously signed juvenile justice reform legislation S48, which I am so very proud of because of the immense work and the great things that it has really done in terms of reforming the juvenile justice system. But S2519 basically made the fee elimination aspect of the law immediately, rather than waiting for S48's law to go into effect. The idea being we don't want anyone sitting in a jail exposing themselves to COVID and limiting the facility's ability to better socially distance just because they can't afford the fee to be addressed. And I believe that we heard much of that in terms of what's happening from Jessica earlier in her comments. This element of the pre-COVID law S48 was set to go into effect in November, but the pandemic made implementing it now and it just made it imperative for us to do that. The last thing that I will bring up before I wrap up in terms of the kind of legislation and that we are doing, both my colleague Senator Cunningham and I are pushing to reform criminal sentencing in New Jersey. The Criminal Sentencing and Disposition Commission goes back to Governor Corzine, but was finally convened under Governor Murphy. And while it was not in its strictest sense a response to COVID-19, this pandemic has illuminated the disparities that we've heard about here, particularly the racial disparities in all aspects of our society, and our criminal sentencing is one, and the criminal sentencing is one of the most appalling and glaring example of our systemic inequities. The majority of the bill package to reform criminal sentencing passed the full passed the full Senate last month, and will, once signed after, it will certainly alter sentencing norms across the board, and maybe most importantly, eliminate mandatory minimums for non-violent offenses. Ultimately, we have too many people in our jails and prisons stuck there for years and more likely to return to a cell upon release than to more likely to return to a cell upon release than to their communities. It is a biased, callous, and flawed system that more negatively impact community of colors in New Jersey and in every state in this country. That is enough feeling. It's a fact. You've heard some of those information be shared today in that PowerPoint that was shared with us. For far too long, our society has comfortably accepted men, women, and juveniles in the criminal system being stripped of not only their rights, but their basic human dignity. It is certainly my hope, ambition, and goal to reverse this dehumanizing and counterproductive complacency in New Jersey during this pandemic and certainly thereafter. I want to take this moment once again to thank all of my partners that I've worked with. Thank you so very much. I know that I've heard many of the wonderful comments that you've said about me, but I know that it takes a team, and that team is surrounded here by many of you. I want to just personally, once again, thank you. Thank you for your contribution, making yourselves available each and every time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Senator Poe. And I'm sure I speak for all the panelists in saying that we are all with you and appreciate everything that you have done on behalf of our clients over so many years. And for those of you who are interested in learning more about 2519 and where we are with it, feel free to reach out to any of us after the panel is over. I want to now turn to Reverend Charles Boyer and back to Alex Shalom, who will share with us some of what has been happening on the grassroots level around advocating for passage of S-2519 and the other pieces of legislation that have been proposed to respond to the pandemic. The Reverend Dr. Charles Franklin Boyer is a third-generation African Methodist Episcopal preacher. He's the pastor of Bethel AME Church in Woodbury, New Jersey, and also the founder of Salvation and Social Justice, which is a nonpartisan Black faith-based organization that, that works to reform many aspects of life in this country and believes that prophetic vision should precede public policy. On a personal note, I have to say that I have watched in awe as Reverend Boyer has been for many years now a leading voice on behalf of people of color and on behalf of social justice in our state and beyond. And it's a real honor to welcome him here today. And he will be joined by, once again, by Alex Shalom, who is very frequently his partner in crime on many of these issues.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. It's truly been a pleasure to work with you for many years on these issues, to really learn from you. It is even a greater greater privilege to now have something in common with Alex besides the fight, which is a beard. I must say he looks extremely handsome with it. And if that goes anywhere besides this panel, I'll deny it, that I complimented him on how great he looks with that. But let me just say, and well, one, I'm going to be brief for the sake of time, because I feel like so many of the most important pieces have been hit. I will go over the few highlights, but I must say, I have to say, as someone who has worked with many legislators on behalf of voices that are so far too often marginalized and separated from the discussion, folks whose voices oftentimes are never heard. The most critical and the most difficult pieces of legislation, but by far the most powerful that I have had opportunity to work on, have all been championed by Senator Poe. And she is extremely modest. I know she's right, it takes a village, but I have to say that when it comes to someone who will stand on principles, who will even challenge us in the advocacy community to make sure that that all perspectives are understood, but someone who will go in and roll up their sleeves and really fight, someone who actually knows every single aspect, every dot, every punctuation in the bill. There is no one better than Nellie Poe. And I can say that without equivocation. She is the absolute best, and she very much cares about youth justice and criminal justice issues. So with all that being said, when you have a champion legislator that you know is going to fight for the most vulnerable, it takes one major burden off of working with the grassroots. Because far too often I feel people get the priorities of the grassroots far too often, I think, gets horse traded in the political process. And so, so one, we, as was mentioned earlier by the most critical voices in this conversation, Brother Clemens and Sister Parks, who have been really critical voices in all of this, we organized a 450-car funeral procession to bring light around this as it was getting introduced. And there were, this was prior to the George Floyd moment, prior to the eruption of protests in the streets. And here it was, one of the first kind of public actions. And we did not expect to get 450 cars and nearly 1,000 people out in front of the war memorial in the midst of a pandemic in the rain.
In the rain.
But that's exactly what happened. People, and mostly folks who had family members incarcerated, or folks who had lost family members, or these were the people on the ground, multiple people to each car that came out to say, please, let's be humane, let's be compassionate, let these people go. And it was a real strong action, and it was strong for this reason. In this work, being a faith leader in this work, so many times the role of kind of my priestly role of ministering to people and the prophetic role of the advocacy piece, they often intersect, but never like it has in this pandemic. We were getting phone calls and direct messages of people who were terrified of what would happen to their family members in prison, people whose family members were infected, people who had lost communication with their family members, people who were grieving. And in my entire experience in this space, I had never felt the gravity of those two roles at the same time. And it really bore down in a way, in an unprecedented way. And one of the reasons why we chose to do a funeral procession was because several reasons. One, these family members had not had a way to mourn their dead. At that point, it was over 40 people who had died. And because of the restrictions, they had no way to mourn their dead. And their lament needed to be heard and needed to move to a prophetic space, which was, don't let this happen to anyone else. And also, as far as many of the people whose family members were either sick or were vulnerable, needing to say, please do something before someone else dies. And so the power of that moment was that it was one of the first times where I saw both of those roles really collide. And Trina Parks, I think about specifically, who has connectivity with the African Methodist Episcopal Church. One of the most powerful moments was she came in and gave a eulogy for her brother and brought all of the bells and whistles of a Black church funeral. There was singing, there was mourning, there was crying, there was lament, and there was prophetic passion. And so I will end with this, that when it comes to the grassroots, the very most important thing we can do is continue to raise the voices. And you've heard how powerful Scott is and how passionate his family is. You've heard Trina Parks and a variety of others that Reverend Cali has worked so vigorously to help organize and give and create space for. And so it is critical that those voices, the grassroots voices, remain first and foremost in these discussions. So thank you for allowing me to have some time to share.
So, Laura said that Reverend Boyer and I were teammates here, and I suppose Steve Kerr was Michael Jordan's teammate, and I feel a little bit like that. But I'm going to, like Steve Kerr, know my role as a role player here, which is just to kind of shoot the open shot. And so I want to just tell one quick story that I think illustrates everything about the grassroots movement here behind this bill, but also reinforces what Reverend Boyer said about Senator Poe. Which was early on, we had this is sausage making, but I don't think I'm telling tales out of school here. Early on, we hit a roadblock with this bill. We had proposed it, and we had some real opposition in the Senate. And it was Senator Poe was chairing her committee, and there was a question of whether or not it was going to get through that day or not. And she called us. She called Charles and me, and we had this conversation. What should I do? I can put the bill through, but only with amendments. That's the only way it gets through today. And the question was, should we add amendments to the bill that would exclude people convicted of certain crimes? And we were very mindful, Charles and Amos and I had been having conversations with people like Scott and others, and we had committed to the families of incarcerated people that we would not exclude people based on crime of conviction, because as Todd Clear has said, it's just not grounded in the science. It's not grounded in the data. And so we said to Senator Poe, we know that the easy thing to do would be to make these amendments and get it through and maybe it moves, but please don't. Please wait and let us fight to have a bill that includes everybody. And Senator Poe, and I've described working with her as it's like watching a master class in legislative advocacy. I feel like I'm playing checkers and she's playing three-dimensional chess all the time here. But that day really solidified that in addition to being smart as all get out and really savvy about how to do the legislative process, she was committed to doing this the right way. And it really came out. And if this bill gets through the assembly, and I believe it will, the grassroots people will have certain people to thank. And Senator Poe is certainly at the top of that. And Mr. Michael Jordan here shaking his head is another one, but we're grateful. And that's because Senator Poe has let the voices of incarcerated people and their families really lead. So I say thank you. And I saw in the questions, someone wanted to know whether there was any impact on the implementation of the Isolated Confinement Restriction Act. And I need not tell you who the sponsor of the Isolated Confinement Restriction Act was. It was none other than Senator Poe. The answer is, yes and no. The bill went into effect on August 1, 2020, as it was intended to. The thing that hasn't happened was the Department of Corrections did not promulgate all the regulations that they've been required to promulgate on time. But as we have made very clear to them, they are bound by that statute from August 1, whether they've promulgated the regulations or not. This, for those who don't know, is the kind of the bill that limits the use of solitary confinement in New Jersey to a certain amount of time for people, and for vulnerable populations excludes it in toto. And that is now the law in New Jersey, again, putting New Jersey at kind of the forefront of this national movement. And I'm sorry that I have to sign off, but I have to run. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Reverend Boyer and Alex. And, you know, once again, I think it's fitting that we started with the importance of the partnership between people in the community, grassroots movements, and lawyers. And we're kind of close to the end and finishing with it. But we're not done yet, because our last speaker is the unparalleled Christina Kersey from the Office of the Public Defender. Christina is one of the leading youth advocates in our state. She is the first Assistant Deputy Public Defender with the New Jersey Office of the Public Defender in Essex County, where she heads up the Juvenile Defense Unit, but she is so much more than that. She co-directs the Northeast Juvenile Defender Center. She is a leading voice in youth justice policy reform in the state. And she is a fabulous advocate. Christina.
Thank you so much, Professor Cohen. As far as youth defense in the state in the midst of COVID, I thought that it was important to address it on 3 different fronts. One was making sure that we were preventing any more children from being admitted into our juvenile detention centers. So here in Essex County, we represent young people when they're arrested 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So we've been working to make sure that no new children are admitted into the detention center. We're also having detention hearings for the children that are already in the detention center to try and see if we can have them released on release conditions with services. And then the last and the most important piece is filing motions for what we call recall, but really what are modifications of sentence for our children that are serving time in the Juvenile Justice Commission, which is our youth prison for the state of New Jersey. So filing recall motions and having them brought back to court and having their sentences either reduced, which would allow them to be released on parole supervision, or having their sentences changed to time served sentences so that they can be released from custody. Unlike how you heard Public Defender Cricora and Alex Shalom speak about the executive order and the order to show cause, with the youth, they each have to be reviewed one by one. They're all different ages and all different crimes, and there's nothing that was filed to try and have them looked at all at one. Although in the order to show cause, we did have a point, and thank you to Professor Cohen and her clinic to really push this, where when we filed those motions for recall to release children from the youth prisons, that the prosecutor's office had to respond within 3 days and that the court had to issue a decision within 5. So we were getting very quick turnaround with answers on these individual motions that were filed. As part of the agency with the Office of the Public Defender, we partner with Professor Cohen's clinic, with Ilana Wilf, who's on the panel, with Tyler Doherty, who have been just instrumental in making sure that our children are reviewed, and that we file as many recall motions as possible to have our youth return back to their communities and back to their families. We've worked with the JJC, and we receive lists of youth that are eligible for release within 6 months. We don't limit our advocacy to those on the list, but we make sure that each child who has a date within 6 months is reviewed individually by the defender or by Professor Cohen's clinic to determine whether or not they're eligible for a recall motion and whether or not we can individually advocate for them to be returned back home. I know that Ms. Wilf had noted some of the numbers, and while there's no effort that is nearly enough until there's no children in our youth prison, I am proud to say that here in Essex County, we filed 10 recall motions. We had our first youth released on March 19th. So we responded very quickly to the pandemic. And although 10 motions doesn't sound like a lot, when you look at the fact that Essex County has 16 kids in the juvenile justice system, you're talking about 10 out of 16. It's a large percentage of kids that we were able to file motions on, get before the court and have the court review and decide whether or not it was time for them to come home. If you have any questions, I don't want to stand between, I'm standing between now the question and answer portion, which I know a lot of people have been looking forward to. So if you have individual questions, I'd be happy to answer. But as far as our office, that's what we've done as far as the youth are concerned.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was a perfect description of months and months of work. So we really appreciate it. I have been kind of monitoring the questions in the chat. I'm not seeing any that haven't been answered yet, but if anybody has a question or two, now is the time to add it in. And I'm not seeing anything pop up. So thank you. First of all, to our attendees. We know that we threw a lot at you. We appreciate the time that you've given to us. We appreciate your participation in the conversation. And we urge you to learn more and to get out there and support Senator Poe's efforts to pass S-2519. And to everyone else on the panel, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, for sharing your experience, for sharing your insights, and for all the work you are doing on behalf of incarcerated people in our state, on behalf of their families, and really on behalf of all of us. I would like to invite you to join us again on October 8th for the second part of this series on people in immigration detention. We'll have another fabulous lineup of speakers for that event. And since you were on the list for this one, I'm sure that you'll be getting more information about registering for that one as well. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.